Okay, so let's go over these. So the first one, we have the salamanders that mate at different times of the year. So if they mate at different times of the year, you're never going to get a zygote form, so that's a pre-zygotic barrier. And because of the timing differences between the mating seasons, that is called temporal isolation. All right. Number 2 says 2 species of mice are mated in the lab. The 2 species, their kids are fertile, so they live and are fertile, but then when they try to mate, then their offspring are sterile. So zygotes were formed, so it's a post-zygotic barrier, but that's the definition of hybrid breakdown. So hybrid breakdown means that you have to look for the 2 species. The kids seem to be okay between the 2 species, but when those kids try to mate, then we start to see. So we'll get, over time, a breakdown in the viability of the offspring. Number 3, you have the fruit flies crossed in the lab, and their offspring are unable to produce eggs and sperm. So therefore, their offspring, so therefore, we had a zygote form. So it's a post-zygotic, and they're unable to produce egg and sperm. So if they're unable to produce egg and sperm, are they able to mate or reproduce? No. And so therefore, that should be reduced hybrid fertility. Okay. Number 4, you have 2 land snails that try to mate, but they don't, quote unquote, fit with each other. So there's no zygote being formed there, so it's a pre-zygotic barrier, and it's mechanical isolation. All right, so mechanical isolation there. 5, we have the male fiddler crabs wave their large claws to attract the attention of females. And each species has a slightly different wave, and so females look for a particular wave in their mate, and therefore that's what keeps them not mating with other species. And so therefore that's a pre-zygotic, and that's behavioral isolation. And then 6, you have different species of tobacco plants crossed in a greenhouse, and the pollen tube bursts before the eggs are fertilized. So remember when flowers in the base of it, the flower has the ovary, and that's where the eggs are, and the pollen contains the sperm, so the pollen lands on the flower, and then it grows a pollen tube, and the sperm swims through that pollen tube to get to the egg. So they're saying here the pollen tube starts to form, but it bursts before it actually gets to the egg. And so therefore fertilization doesn't happen, and so that's a pre-zygotic barrier. And I'm curious what you guys put for what type of pre-zygotic. Gametic isolation, all right, where the gametes never get to one another, all right. I had in other hours some people talk about maybe mechanical because the pollen tube isn't working properly. It's bursting before you get to that. So I guess I could see that argument there, but it's generally classified as gametic isolation. And then 7, you have the 2 oak trees living in different areas, so therefore the pollen doesn't get from one species to another, so therefore there's not a zygote form, so that's pre-zygotic, and that's habitat isolation, because they're isolated via their habitat. And then lastly, there's a typo here, it has an L in there, it's actually a tigon, is the offspring of a lion and tiger. There are tigons and there are ligers. It depends which one it is, depends upon which species is the mom and which species is the dad. So like in the naming, so tigon, the tiger, that is the first part of the name, that always is referring to the dad. So it has a tigon, has a tiger that's a dad and a lion that's a mom. And then a liger has a lion that's a dad and a tiger that's a mom. All right, and so this is the tigon are often weak and unhealthy. So clearly we have a zygote formed because we have an organism, the tigon, so it's post-zygotic. And they're weak and unhealthy. What do you think best fits that? Yeah, reduced hybrid viability. Absolutely. Alrighty. And yes.
How healthy is the liger?
You know, they used to think that they were sterile. I think they have recorded some mating though, but they're not as unhealthy. They still have some health issues, but not as unhealthy as the tiger. All right, yeah. So, but they do. And speaking of liger, I have just a National Geographic little bit of video clip to show you the liger, just because they're pretty cool. They're humongous. They're very big.
That makes sense.
Much bigger than either of their parents.
No, I know, but like,
Because they're bigger than either one of their parents. They're going to talk about this. They don't directly talk about it, but indirectly. They talk about so a liger has a lion for a dad. In the genes, they have the genes that the dad gives to the kids, so to the liger, have genes that make them grow big. But in lion to lion mating, so both of male and female are lion, the female actually has genes that counteract that, and so therefore they don't get humongous. But in this case here, you have the lion that's the dad, and a tiger that's the mom, and you don't have those counteracting genes, and so you get this huge. All right. All right, so here we go.
lion, tigers, and ligers.
Come on.
Weighing in at nearly a ton and as big as a horse, the liger is the true definition of wiener. The hybrid offspring of a male lion and a female tiger, ligers are only created when the two rival cat species meet in captivity. And clearly, opposites attract. The resulting genetic cocktail cooks up a giant. A super cat that is so big may be too heavy to hunt. In the lion world, size equals dominance. So male lions pass on genes that encourage growth. But the females know that big doesn't always equal better. And their genes keep male cubs from getting too large. So it's thought that their whole litter has a better chance to survive. Tigresses don't carry a gene that inhibits the size of their cubs. So when a tigress falls for a guy from the wrong continent, their baby can end up bigger than both of the parents combined. That may be a face even a mother can't love.
Wait, but they never showed like humans. They didn't show like.
Oh, you want to see a human standing next to a liger?
What about horse?
Well, because you don't know how big that is, like, really.
Yeah. Well,
No,
yeah.
it's pretty.
I want to see
I mean, it's pretty big, but I want like a banana for comparison.
like how big is it?
Banana for scale.
It's tight, like, you put in your She's on it. She's on it. She's on it. Oh no. Look at them laying down. Oh my goodness. She's got the baby.
Well, the ligers are only predators. Their habitat isolated.
But they could just go.
But they're, like, so these people probably know them since they were in college. You know what I mean? But yes, they can always just like they'll want. There was a you guys are too young. There was an act in Las Vegas that where they tigers on stage and he got mauled by the tiger.
That'd be so smart. Yeah, that's what everyone has to do. And then he was coming
Alright, guys. So we have some barriers that keep species from kind of merging into one species. And then in our notes, I talked about two different ways. I talked about this picture here, in which speciation can happen. Either the organisms can be geographically isolated, like these two species here. I used the example across the Grand Canyon, and so they physically cannot mate. They're geographically isolated, and that therefore the gene pools can't mix. And so therefore these guys over here mate with each other, these guys over here mate with each other, and eventually they can accumulate, the P and the Q can change enough that if you put them together again, they don't mate with one another. And so that means that's the beginning of the divergence into two different species. But not all species have to be geographically isolated. And so that's sympatric speciation, where they can be in the same area. And that was the end of the notes that I left off with plants, and how plants can have mistakes in meiosis and lead, because since plants can self-pollinate and so on, can lead to new species that way. And so then that's where I want to pick up. Let's see here. This is where we're at. So use the example with an animal to show you how animals that live together in a particular area, they don't have to be geographically isolated to actually diverge into different species. And the example I'm going to use is with these cichlid fish. Cichlid fish, we now know, have undergone sympatric speciation in certain areas. And so I'm going to use the example in Africa. There's a lake called Lake Victoria that has lots of different species of fish. I put up here. You don't have this, but I just typed up in here to give an example. So they have over 600 species of fish. I put a little statistic in there just to give you an idea of how diverse that is. That's for the whole continent of Europe. Every lake and every type of fish in the whole Europe, there's more types of cichlids in this one lake in Africa than in the whole continent of Europe. All right, so it's very diverse. So it sticks out as being like, whoa, you know, what's going on here? And so I did some studies to figure out what was going on. So the first hypothesis was that these different cichlids ate off of different foods sources in the lake, and therefore diverged into different species. That was the first hypothesis. And the second one is that there was sexual selection going on. What is sexual selection going on? What that means is the cichlids is actually what we call female choice. The females look for certain characteristics in the mate. So that could be behavioral characteristics, like we just talked about, the waving of the claw, all right, and so on. And it could be some organisms do a little mating dance, all right, and so on. My husband used to do mating dance. He had lizards and reptiles, and so he used to try to breed them. And so when we first got married, we had a 2-bedroom apartment, and we had a bedroom and a lizard. so he had different kinds, but he got the idea in his head. I'm going to try and breed these water dragons, and he had this big cage, and it had water in the part, and they built a platform with tree branches and stuff like that, and so on. And so when it was mating time, the male would do the little dance here. He'd get up on the branch, and he'd take his arm and he'd go like this, and then he'd go like this, and then that's what the female was looking for that particular species. All right, and so it's kind of comical to watch. It never really worked out. We never got living. Well, they mated, but the eggs we were never able to like fully develop them and hatch them, which I was kind of happy about. I really should have cold. All right, so sexual selection is looking for a particular characteristic. It could be behavior, it could be coloration. So like in a lot of species, females look for specific colors in their mates. So an example is cardinals. When you think of cardinals, you think of probably the color red, right? But all the red cardinals are males. The female cardinals are actually brown, kind of brownish color. And that's because the females look for that coloration in their mate. And so if you're a cardinal and you're a male and you're not a nice pretty red, that's bad news for you because you're not going to be able to get to mate and you're not going to pass on your genes to the next generation. But the guy next to you that's nice and bright and red, he is going to be able to mate, pass his genes on to the next generation, and so we get that divergence. Same thing with mallard ducks, the pretty green head, and the females are brown. All right, so blue jays. All right, so let's go back to these cichlid fish. So they wanted to figure out what was going on here to cause this divergence, and so they took two species out of the lake. These are the two species. And they put the species together in two different tanks. So you have some of each species in this tank, some of each species in this tank. They kept everything the same between the tanks, except they shone different light on it. So this is normal light. Normal light has like just regular ultraviolet or the broad spectrum white light here, and so it reflects certain wavelengths of light, and the fish appear different colors. And so this species, this is what they look like, and this species, this is what they look like. And then the second tank, they shone monochromatic orange light, and under this type of light, it reflects the different wavelengths, and this is what they look like. So you can see that they look more similar in the monochromatic orange light. So then they have them in there, and they're swimming around and so on in the different lights. And what they did is they took notes and recorded their mating behaviors. And so what they found is that here, in this one, in normal light, the females of this species chose the males of this species and didn't do anything have anything to do with these guys. And the same thing with this. So they kept within their same species. When they looked at it going on in the monochromatic orange light, what they found is that the females in each species started mating with the males of the other species. So they also mated with males of their own species, but also males with the other species. So what do you think that says? What they learned from that? Liam?
Well, two things. Number one, that it's dependent on color, like cardinals. And the other thing is that the fish have some type of color vision, which I think you did tell me about.
That's right. All right, so they are able to see at least these colors. All right, and that coloration is what's helping to determine which one they mate with. And so when you take that fact away and you don't have the coloration, then they still mate, but there's no distinguishing factor between the two, and so they'll mate with either one of them. All right, and so that what shows what they figured out is that sexual selection was going on. Because in Lake Victoria, it's not monochromatic orange light, all right? So that was just in the lab. So it's more like this situation. So these guys, what has happened is that they have diverged. These guys now look for specific coloration patterns, and these guys look for specific coloration patterns, and they don't mate, even though they could mate. So what they found is that when they studied and saw that they could mate and actually looked at the fish, the hybrid fish, the fish grew up fine, and actually the fish could mate and have their own kids and so on, so they were just fine in terms of health and so on. So what that also told them is that this divergence of this into two separate species was probably pretty recent, because there's not enough differences between them to cause one of those barriers that we just talked about, all right? And so, so that happened right in the same lake, and we have over 600 species in that one lake. So, to wrap this up, in allopatric speciation, remember, a new species formed while geographically isolated from its parent population, and then sympatric speciation, a reproductive barrier isolates a part of the population without geographic separation. speciation can occur quite rapidly, and this is called adaptive radiation, the evolution of diversely adapted species from a single common ancestor upon introduction to new environmental opportunities. So sometimes if you have a new environment open up, that single species can become many. And so I used this example when I talked about the Galapagos Islands and how they're formed from volcanoes. Nothing before lived there, but now we have lots of species that are found nowhere else on the earth. And I used the beaks and the finches as an example of that, where they have a common ancestor that from the coast of South America, they go and inhabit these different islands. Each island has different characteristics, and therefore different traits are beneficial on those various islands. And so eventually the species adapts to those various islands, and now when those birds come together, they don't mate anymore, kind of like the cichlids. And so an example of this is this group of plants in Hawaii. So this is the Hawaiian Islands. Hawaiian Islands are volcanic islands as well, so it's the same kind of story as the Galapagos Islands, where you have all these species that are found nowhere else on the earth. And so then these plant species, seeds blow in and land in the various islands, which are different, have different resources and so on, and over millions of years we have different species on the different islands. So they have the same common ancestor. And so now we can actually study speciation in more detail than we ever have before. The explosion of genomics, studying DNA, being able to sequence genes and identify genes, and looking at that has helped us to kind of tell the story of speciation over time. And so then we also have used in the fossil record, the fossils to kind of look at the tempo or timing of speciation. So the fossil record includes many episodes in which new species appear suddenly in a geologic stratum. I'll talk about what that is in just a second. Persist essentially unchanged through several strata, and then apparently disappear. And so these two scientists, Eldridge and Gould, coined the term punctuated equilibrium. Describes periods of apparent stasis. That means no change. Punctuated are kind of interrupted by sudden change. And this model of punctuated equilibrium contrasts with the model of gradual change in a species' existence. Question?
Wasn't this punctuated equilibrium what happened with the Neanderthals with humans? How they were like with us until like 40,000 years ago, and then they suddenly just vanished.
That's right.
But we can actually still see it in our DNA. I thought
Yeah, you can compare if you have samples to compare to, yeah.
Yeah, I thought like modern day Europeans, I don't know why it's Europeans, have anywhere from like 1 to 4% Neanderthal DNA.
Right. Yeah. Let me talk a minute so that you understand about strata and stratum. Stratum is singular, strata is plural. Most fossils are found in sedimentary rocks. We talked about that before. Sedimentary rock, the organism dies. The fleshy parts are decayed by microorganisms and so on, leaves the bones behind. It gets covered with sediments. This usually happens in water. Minerals get into the pores, the bones fossilize, the sediments build up, it gets pressurized and forms into rocks. And then the next organism comes over here, dies, and the same thing happens, and you get another layer. And so sedimentary rock is found in layers. So if you go down sedimentary rock, you get lots of layers. And you see those layers like from the Grand Canyon, the Colorado River has eroded, so the Colorado River is way down here. It's not on the surface where you walk anymore because the river has been flowing, all right, for millions of years. And now on the sides of the Grand Canyon, you see these strata or layers of rock, that's sedimentary rock. And so what happens is that you have your oldest fossils and oldest layer here, and I put the person up here to show that this is the newest, and that's where you walk. And so on. So each one of these are stratum. Collectively, we say strata. All right? And so that's where you find your fossils. And so punctuated equilibrium, as it says here, says you have a new species appear suddenly in a stratum. So let's say species A here. And it persists unchanged through several strata and then disappears. All right? And so that's what that means here. And so, so you have these periods of no change, and then sometimes it can be punctuated by a sudden change. So then we have, it looks a little bit different, all right, in the next layer. So let's look at this picture here. This is what this picture is trying to show you here. On the right hand side, it shows punctuated equilibrium, and this is time, oldest to newest. And so they're using butterflies as an example, but we would use realistically the fossil record. And so we have this older species that's found, let's say, in the oldest fossil record. And then as we look at the fossil record, then all of a sudden we see this species and this species. And so they appear to be suddenly. So over time here, as we go up, all right, to the newer layers, we find this fossil, and then boom, we get this fossil, and then it seems like over here we still have this same older one, and we have a newer one here, and it seems to be sudden. So that's the punctuated equilibrium model, is that we have these sudden changes that occur very quickly, and then long periods of time where we don't see changes. And versus, some people say, well, it didn't just suddenly happen. So this is the gradualism model. So notice here you have your ancestor, and then you have these two new species here. And so they're showing you from here to here that it didn't just change into a new species, that occurred gradually over time. Same thing with this one, gradually over time. And so there are two kind of different ways to describe this tempo or timing of speciation. And what we have to go on is the fossil record from things that happened in the past. So let's look at this. So for instance, if this from here to here, let's say that time span is 3 million years. Right? So from here to here, that's a small portion of the 3 million years. So let's say that that's 50,000 years, which in the grand scheme of things, 50,000 years isn't that long in the history of the Earth. To us, it seems like a long time, all right, but it's not that long. And is everything fossilized? No. And so could, from here to here, could gradualism have happened? Yes, absolutely, that could have happened. It's just not shown in the fossil record. And so we don't have, if it's not shown in the fossil record, we don't have proof either that it did or didn't, all right? And so then some organisms, by luck, show in the fossil record, you can see gradualism because different organisms were fossilized, so you can kind of see the progression.
Is that why it's so hard to trace back, like, how, like, connections between, like, where the humans and, like, Neanderthal and all, like, the parts that we haven't found, like, the specific place where
Yes.
we, like, buried
Yes.
those huge maps.
Yes.
Now we keep finding more species too.
Right. And this relationship and stuff, this can always change too as we find new things. All right, absolutely. So it's basically just taking all the facts that you have at your disposal today and trying to figure that out. All right, so what we do know is that new species arise from reproductive isolation over time, which can involve thousands or millions of years, or it can occur pretty rapidly, like polyploidy in plants, like bacteria in a laboratory, where you can see the evolution and the change of the organism very quickly. All right, so it depends. All right, I'm going to come back to this horse tree after. That's what they call it. They call these a phylogenetic tree, and it shows the kind of the evolutionary relationship of the horse. I'm going to come back to this after I teach you, as we get into chapter 25, about how to read these trees. And so we'll come back to this. Question?
Isn't it possible for take a species that is like a descendant out of like an ancestral species, for instance, like some dinosaurs are direct ancestors of some tree like chicken, and then like some process you could mess the chicken's genes, like so like the genes like their genes,
I've seen like
and then
these.
it goes back to the ancestral genes, which then grows to get dinosaurs. This is something I've heard. I don't know what they did, although I'm not sure how. Cook. This is what Cook would do.
That I'm not sure about.
That seems really conflated. They used it's a method called CRISPR. Have you heard of it? Yeah, they use that to cut out the chicken gene that codes.
That's a baby one.
Yeah, and then it like sorts back to.
I know.
I'm not trying to find it.
All right, so let's look at chapter 25, which is about looking at the relationships between the evolutionary relationships between organisms. So this is called phylogeny, and those trees that, like that horse tree, is called a phylogenetic tree. So it's the evolutionary history of a particular species or group of related species. And so systematics classifies organisms on Earth and then kind of groups them and then tries to figure out their evolutionary relationships. And so how we do this and figure out evolutionary relationships is use all the data that we have at our disposal. So what data is that? That's the fossil record. It's molecular data, like so comparing proteins and so on. Genetic data, sequencing. We now have, in the last 80 years, we've come a long way in terms of now being able to sequence DNA, tell how much we have in common with different organisms, which then can show relationships between organisms. So this is an example of a phylogenetic tree, and it's very simplistic, and it has obviously a human as a mushroom and a tulip, and it has this branching system. Can anybody tell me something that you could infer from this picture? What is something that we could say about these organisms looking at this picture? Colin?
Human mushroom and flower come from common ancestor.
Okay, so the human, mushroom, and flower come from a common ancestor. Where would that be on this? All right, the far left here. So right here is that first divergence. What else, Liam?
That a mushroom is more closely related to a human than a flower.
All right, then a mushroom is more closely related to a human than a flower. All right, and that's because of this more recent common ancestor versus the common ancestor between all of these guys. And so how would we be able to tell that? So what kind of data? Right now, we would be able to use genetic data. All right, so actually sequencing the genes between humans and mushrooms and so on. It used to be that not all the time we would be able to do that to compare the DNA. So we looked at other things and some physical characteristics and so on and so forth. But physical characteristics doesn't always mean relatedness. All right, so DNA is a better source of that information.
That's true though, right? That mushrooms and fungus are more related to us than plants, animals than plants.
All right, so let's look at the grouping of organisms, taxonomy, the order, division, and naming of organisms. So we name organisms by this process called binomial nomenclature. This scientist named Carl Linnaeus published a system of taxonomy based upon similarities between organisms. Two key features of his system. He came up with two-part names for species, and he classified organisms in this kind of hierarchy that I'll talk about here. So the two-part scientific name of a species is called a binomial. So bi meaning two, G names. The first part of the name is the genus. And the second part, called the specific epithet, or what it basically is it's talking about the species, individual species. Does anybody know our scientific name? Homo sapiens. So when we look at this, Homo sapien. This is what we call our genus. It's always capitalized, and this is our species. And so this is our binomial name here as for us. In typewritten, this would be, I mean, in italics. All right, so let's talk about what a genus and a species is. So we have these increasingly broad categories, yes?
I was just gonna ask, like, isn't there really like a system to that, or is like the person who discovers it, like, pretty much can name it anything they want as long as it's Latin?
Yeah.
Because there are some that's like
Yes.
David Bowie is, like, and Beyonce is, or something like no, those are actual species of like chicken and
Yeah, the person you get to name. Yes. People have gotten a little bit more crazy about that than they used to in the past. All right, so here are the groups, from broad to narrow. So the order of this is important, broad to narrow. So we have domain. So you're writing it down. We have the domain. We have kingdom. Phylum. Class. Order. Family. Genus. And species. So broad to narrow. So what does this mean? Let me draw up here on the board. We took all living things on Earth. So everything that's alive. So all living things have some things in common as a living organism. But then we break them down into smaller groups. And so the most broad, smaller group is the domain. So we've talked about this before in this class. I've talked about the 3 domains. You guys remember what they are?
Oh, yeah. You're right. There was one where it was just bacteria.
One is just bacteria. Archaea. And eukarya. And so all the living things in this domain have certain things in common that make them different than all the things in this domain, and these guys have certain things in common, these guys have certain things in common. So then each domain is then categorized into different kingdoms. So we're in the domain eukarya because we're made out of eukaryotic cells. We're in the same domain as like a little one-celled euglena, which are a little one-celled organism. It has a nucleus, so it's a eukaryote, but it swims in fresh water. And so we belong all in the same kingdom because we have certain characteristics in common, but we also have things that are very different. And so therefore we take our domain, and each domain is subdivided into different kingdoms. And so we have the plant kingdom, we have the animal kingdom, we have the kingdom fungi, which is the fungus, and so on. Each kingdom, let's say this is the animal kingdom, each kingdom is then subdivided into different phyla, and then each phyla into different classes, each class in a different order, and so on and so forth. I'm not going to write that all down here, but so on and so forth until you end up with organisms of the same species, which is the most specific. Okay? Question?
Is there like animals or species that can fall under like technically falling under
Yeah, well, there's one, they used to call it Protista, the kingdom Protista, which are basically, it had a catch-all of like, most of them were unicellular, but some of them were multicellular. Now they're they're changing this classification system based upon new things that we learned. In fact, Linnaeus, the guy who came up with this to begin with, there wasn't even such a thing as domain. This was about maybe 15 years ago that they came up with the domain. So there used to be kingdoms. Linnaeus, when he first came up with this, he had 2 kingdoms, plant and animal. That was it. All right. Then we had things like a microscope, and they said, "Oh, there's living things in like this pond water that are only 1 cell big." And so then so we learn more and more. So it's just a way for us as humans to kind of understand the living world in our place in it and different relationships between organisms. So it's a work in progress as new things come about.
So is there any species that like has its own kingdom because it's so unique to itself?
No. You can discover that.
So I know that viruses evolve and they have basically their own genetic tree. Where did they fall on?
They don't. Yeah, because technically they're not deemed as a living thing.
But if they evolve and they change over
I'm just
time.
telling you that it's on.
But science is getting crap together.
All right. So a taxonomic unit at any level is called a taxon. So if you hear the word taxon, it's talking about any group. So we could say that this domain, bacteria, is a taxon, or the animal kingdom is a taxon. So a unit at any level is just, in general, called a taxon. And so this picture here shows you the hierarchy for the classification of a leopard. All right, and so I'm going to have you write this down.
Maybe he just released
That looks more like a cheetah.
Yeah, no, on the next page it'll say leopard. So I don't know.
Are you sure it's not panther?
No?
Panther, yeah.
Well, that's the genus.
Could be a panther. Could be a panther that is just fabulous.
According to
The dumb scientist community that doesn't think false.
Whoa.
No, I love the scientific. I just think they need to get their crap together with the virus tree testing.
They're not living.
I'm gonna write a
I
whole
love the
deal
passion.
to the king of science. Like, oh, it's not-
So it's carnivore, like,
Yeah.
So these are all like
Fidelia,
looking to
the
that
feline.
species each.
There's
Well, that's where that species falls. Okay. So. Flat. Good friends with Alright, what's up?
Could you do this sort of like for you to be Animalia, Chordata, Amelia, Almeria, and then primate?
Yeah, except they already have,
Oh, I mean sort of family.
Okay, yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
No, it's just
I
like.
thought you were just saying, just do this.
No. And then genus, what is? And then homo Oh, what? Oh, I switch. All right.
I'm like, you're ready to go somewhere.
That's stupid that we don't have a virus.
I'm sorry.
But how can they
Oh.
like?